Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller. I'm a family physician here working in East London at CMH and also a senior lecturer with WUSU. But that's not the reason why I am on this session today. So tonight I'm actually here as a parent of two transgender kids. My eldest is non-binary and my second one is a trans boy. And we have decided that we would love to have an interface with clinicians a little bit from a parent's point of view. And we are very pleased to welcome Melinda and Jonathan. And Melinda as a parent and as Jonathan as somebody that's been very involved in actually running a parent group, which I have managed to attend one of their online sessions that they're actually running from Joburg. They've also got lots of in-person sessions, and they're going to tell us and give us some feedback of that experiences of that group. So we're going to start off with a half an hour presentation looking at with Melinda and Jonathan. I'm just
I think it's either Nicole or Madeleine who needs to be on mute.
There we go. Alma, maybe you can mute them. I don't seem to be able to do it from my... There we go. So yes, very welcome to Melinda and Jonathan. I said earlier, I warned Melinda, I'm going to ask you each to please introduce yourselves properly because I do not have a nice posh piece of paper here with all your details on it. So you can tell us a little bit about yourselves, and then I'm sure you'll tell us lots about the group. And then after that, we will have a panel discussion, and we'll introduce ourselves, those of us on the panel at that point, just a few parents, and create an open discussion around the interaction between parents and clinicians around transgender healthcare. So thank you very much to Melinda and Jonathan. Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you to start sharing your slides.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. Sure, are the slides showing up again?
Perfect, thank you, yes.
Okay, great. Melinda, just while I'm quickly setting up, if I can ask you just to introduce yourself, please.
Yes, good evening, everybody. It does seem like normally when we start online like this, Jonathan, we check in with everyone. So I'll just check in with all of you and say hello. And it's really great to be with you. And when Madeleine said she doesn't have a piece of paper with bios on, I thought, oh, I do. So I pop one into the chat for your use and sharing. And it's basically the one-page bio that we share with anybody who joins our group that just says a little bit about the four of us who co-convene this group. So my name is Melinda, and I'm the parent of a transgender child. And for my day job, I work in operations, and in the last couple of years, I've worked for a really interesting research organization based at Wits University. But before that, I was a civil servant for 20 years, which I absolutely loved. And I think that's probably enough about me. Jonathan, how are you doing? Do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Thanks for checking in, Melinda. I appreciate starting in a support group manner. I actually wanted to check in with everybody. So my name is Jonathan Bozworth. I'm a counseling psychologist in Melville, Johannesburg, and I'm the other co-facilitator of the group. And I think you'll get to know more about Melinda and I as we go along in today's presentation. So this is a presentation we originally actually did for the World Association for Sexual Health Congress in 2021. So that's where the presentation started, but it's actually been nice to kind of go back to the presentation and actually develop it a bit and kind of reflect actually how things have evolved over the last year to 18 months. Okay, so I think kind of a broader framework just to think about kind of the need for a support group. And you'll see kind of today we'll be kind of partly talking about the group and experiences from the group, and obviously kind of sharing experiences and knowledge in that sense. But I think also a lot of today's meeting is really about thinking about the needs and experience of parents. So also be kind of really, I think we'll be really pushing in that direction, kind of talking about the group to think about actually what are the needs of parents and how do we assist parents in different ways, even if it's not in a support group manner. Okay, so we know that gender diverse youth are particularly vulnerable. They have particular health needs, particularly mental health needs, often socially stigmatized in our current society. But I think often that vulnerability is really shared by the people around them and shared by their parents and their caregivers and their siblings, kind of their educators. So also knowing that kind of if we are going to help gender diverse youth, we also really need to kind of look at how do we help the people around them? And I think we also know that research is really showing that more that gender diverse youth get support from their families, the better health outcomes for the youth are. Okay, so if we can support the parents and the parents can support the youth, we know that's quite a strategic intervention. So I think where the group started was, I think it's since kind of August 2019, so it's been a while since we've been going. But I think Melinda and I kind of been feeling a bit stuck and frustrated around how do we improve things. So, as a psychologist working a lot with kind of trans children, trans adolescents, Linda being a parent of a trans adolescent, trying to think about actually how do we improve things. And I think kind of actually offering support, but often the support being quite isolated. I think Melinda may be able to speak up more about this, but kind of having a lot of parents in your living room. I think your son getting quite frustrated, that kind of just helping everybody. I think a lot of us worried about you burning yourself out. I think doing really important work, but a lot to carry by yourself. And then I just know as a psychologist, there's something very different, kind of sort of parents hearing something from their child or hearing something from you as a healthcare professional versus hearing this from other parents. When you thought this would be quite a strategic point of entry to actually kind of engage this. And I think this is where we started conversations with Makani and Matimba, and then also Aranti at that time, kind of speaking to different NGOs around actually what's possible and how do we help this. And I think there'd also been some picnics that had happened. I think Aranti and Matimba had held some picnics. We'd also held a day at the Aranti's offices, trying to think about this. So we'd also had ad hoc events, but there was nothing continuous or readily available. It was kind of quite ad hoc and isolated. So I think kind of the idea was really to create something that was a lot more structured, and it would also kind of speak to sustainability around actually creating longer lasting change, and obviously creating resources that are continuously accessible. Okay, so this is how we got together as a group, and we decided to then meet on a monthly basis. I think we were really struck at our first meeting just how many people attended. We had over 30 parents and children and adolescents kind of attend the first meeting, and I think we were all quite struck. It was quite a special moment. We panicked a bit. We were supposed to meet in Ngala's offices, and actually realized that kind of the archive, the library actually wasn't big enough, and luckily Melinda works a floor down from Ngala, and we could shuffle everybody downstairs. And it was quite a special moment, because I think just for many people it was quite profound that it's not just me that's going through this as a trans person or non-binary person. It's not just me going through this as a parent or caregiver, but actually there's other people going through this. And I think that felt quite special. I think we often hear about kind of what's going on overseas, kind of in the UK or the US, but actually kind of something happening locally, and these flesh and blood people sitting around them and seeing also maybe they're also a little bit anxious or a bit nervous about this, but they're also struggling with this, or they're celebrating that. And I think it was quite a special moment to get together. So I think that's where we started, and I think then continued for a few months in person, and then obviously the pandemic happened. So we'll also be talking a little bit how that I think impacted the group processes. Okay, Melinda, to hand back to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as Jonathan said, that first meeting in 2019 of the group, I think we had over 50 people in the room, was a little bit of a shock, but also a moment of really realizing how important it was to create these spaces. And since then, we've been speaking a bit about, what are the trends, how have things changed. And I was thinking today, can I really say 2 or 3 new families a month? Maybe it's less. And as I sat down to join the Zoom tonight, chips, there was another email from a new parent saying, oh, I just read about you in the Fair Lady. And I'm like, what? They've heard about our support group in the Fair Lady, which is great. And I think that's really important, is that slowly we are reaching people as they need us, and not like so many months later when they're desperate. And that I think has been quite a big change. And so as Jonathan says, we were meeting in person in Johannesburg. And then when the pandemic hit, we moved online. And that changed the nature of the group, in that there are quite a lot of people. There were, for example, some grandparents who used to come quite regularly who were not comfortable in the online space. So we've lost them. But on the positive side, we met, for example, 2 South African families living in different countries in other parts of the world, who could then join us and figure out how to transition their children back into South Africa. So that's been really great. And what we're going to try and do going forward, we've started this year, 2023, is we're going to try and service both kinds of audiences, as it were, and have most of our meetings online, but at least one per quarter in person. We, as Jonathan said as well, we separate out the meetings between the parents and caregivers and the youth. And we need a space that provides two very private spaces. And it is something that I think we've said before, Jonathan, but it bears repeating, is that, you know, I think the parents come thinking that they need to be there to support their children, and then their children need a space. But the youth feel very empowered and very clear about the fact that they've had a lot of success with the adults in the support group. So we need to keep on meeting because we need the support space. They're really fun, thank you very much, and they just want to hang out. So that was something that was quite interesting for me, because my main motivator for being part of this initiative was to create community for my trans son. But as it turns out, he came to like the first meeting and then said, well, Mom, you do you. I'm very glad that you're going. I think you need the support space. I'm fine. And so we've had that kind of a response from the youth, as well as a lot of young people who are just really happy to find other kids who are like them. So as Jonathan mentioned as well, we, the two of us, facilitate the adult space. And then there are two transgender adults who work in the NPO sector who facilitate the youth hangout. We've tried to be deliberate about planning and about debriefing after our support groups. And I think sometimes we get a little bit, I mean, I speak for myself. I'm like, ugh, I'm done. It's Saturday afternoon. No, I don't need a debrief. I'm out of here. But I do actually think that the discipline that Jonathan brings to our group, the professional discipline that he brings, is really important. And on that note, I'll hand back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Melinda. It's actually just maybe speaking about in an ad hoc way. I think it's been one of the really nice things about the group is actually partly as a professional and then partly as a parent running the group. There's something about just having quite different strengths, having very different frames, being able to say very different things. So I know that's really been quite a nice, I know, like, for example, the last year the symposium was about interdisciplinary collaboration, but I think that's really helped with the group. Actually, just, I know there's certain things I get to say, and certain things it's much better that Melinda says them, and we sometimes are good cop, bad cop, or we can take on different points of view, which I think actually kind of does create a certain safety in the group, or yeah, kind of allows us to kind of be quite strategic around how to think about things. Okay, so I think really what the key of this presentation is not just about the group, but actually kind of what we've learned about the group and with regards to the needs of parents and caregivers of gender diverse youth. Okay, so obviously kind of emotional needs are quite important. I'm trying to not get into the psychological side of it here, but actually trying to think about what we've learned on the ground, actually kind of thinking about, you know, bottom up. As I said earlier on, I think kind of one of the most powerful things about our first meeting, and I think it actually continues with each meeting, is actually parents just seeing other parents going through something similar. It's not just me doing this by myself, but actually I'm going through this. And actually, weirdly enough, a lot of this is quite familiar. It's quite funny how kind of parents light up as they kind of hear other parents speaking. Actually, this kind of thing that felt very nuanced or very strange is actually not unusual here. So there's something about, I think a big emotional kind of component is around actually the normalization. Actually, someone is going through this, and I suppose that also speaks to containment. There's something about somebody else is going through this, but I can share this, I can relate to it, and I think that puts parents a lot at ease. I think just also being able to talk about these things, kind of actually be able to express what they're going through and actually talk about these things with other people that are willing to listen. I think it's also one of the things I think for many parents can be quite isolating. Your child comes out to you. I think for many parents, it might not be possible to share that with anybody else yet. Kind of, you don't want to out your child, or it might be quite sensitive, or you're trying to figure out where your child's at before kind of disclosing it to anybody else. So it can be quite an isolating journey at times. So I think just having a space that's confidential, but a space where other people also have similar ideas or also open to listening to, I think is quite important for the expression. So sometimes just getting things out, and I think kind of parents listening to themselves and listening to each other really makes quite a big difference. I think there's something about the emotional containment. So I think just kind of things being put into context, just being heard, knowing that these things are manageable, seeing other people find their way with them, I think kind of makes quite a big difference. I think other needs, I suppose, linked to the emotional are kind of also just kind of understanding and kind of making sense of things. And I suppose often this can be kind of us kind of answering, or kind of other parents answering quite kind of cognitive type of questions. How does this work? Or what do the standards of care say about this? Or which professional will be able to guide us here? Sometimes it is that type of understanding, but often it's an emotional digesting. It's actually kind of, how do I really make sense of this? Kind of, what is it that's pushing my buttons? And my child's non-binary. Why am I finding that particularly difficult? And I think I might find it a bit easier if my child was kind of binary trans, and what is so much more challenging about being non-binary? And I think parents then also really been able to reflect on kind of what are they finding challenges. So there's also that emotional understanding. And I use non-binary as an example as well, just because I think sometimes there are, I suppose, things that are more commonplace, and things that kind of seem a bit more nuanced for parents. And I know sometimes it's been a little bit more challenging for parents of non-binary children, actually parents of children that aren't non-binary, to understand, for example, what it means to be non-binary, and I suppose the many different experiences that come with being non-binary. So I think sometimes that is also getting into different areas and being able to hone in on that. But I think it's also great kind of having a wide representation of different experiences in the group. I know sometimes it fluctuates. Sometimes we have one parent of non-binary child, and then in the next meeting we can have 5 parents of non-binary children. So it also makes a difference when parents can see each other in other people. So I think it's also been nice to see that the group composition change and fluctuate over time, but generally there's a mirroring. I think ideally, what we know from literature is kind of acceptance and support really makes a very big difference. But I think this has kind of been one of the things that's really stood out for me in the group is this is definitely not a linear process. This is not a straightforward process. And I think it's been an honor to, sit in the group now for over 3 years and actually see that generally things do get better. I think generally parents feel much more empowered. They kind of report back their children are doing much better. But knowing that also that process is not always straightforward. So often parents would get better, things would settle. There's I think Melinda will talk about it now, but often a lot of the initial conversation is kind of how do we come out? How do we negotiate this with kind of extended family? How do we negotiate this with the school? So those are often kind of some of the earlier things. And then things settle and things get better, but then actually other times things kind of actually regress a bit. There's something difficult happens. Dating comes up, for example, and that's, wow, okay, this is a curveball. How do we deal with that? And there's a bit of I think sometimes when parents have a little bit of a wobbly or feel a lot more vulnerable and kind of almost regress back a bit or feel a bit more shaken, or so I think there's there is genuine overall progression, but I think sometimes there's a back and forth in that actually on a smaller scale, which I think is quite important to acknowledge. I think it also just normalizes that experience for parents, but I think also it helps us also expect that it's actually okay that things don't just gradually get better, but we know that things will gradually get better, but actually sometimes there's a back and forth in that. So I think that's also been quite helpful to sit with. It's also been really helpful having parents that have been there from the beginning, or parents that have been quite seasoned in the group, but also in their experiences with their children. And then, as Melinda says, often kind of a few parents, kind of new parents joining each month. And then there's quite a nice conversation between parents that have a little bit more experience and parents that are a little bit newer. Because I think that also kind of normalizes, okay, we have come from here, things have got better, but actually maybe sometimes we still struggle. And I think kind of holding that space. And I think it's also just really great to see how the needs evolve over time and actually trying to make sure that we are meeting those nuanced specific needs of parents. I think then kind of obviously kind of also knowing that kind of from a broader perspective for the gender diverse child, kind of safe gender exploration and development is also quite important. But I think often containing parents in that, actually kind of if parents feel like this feels safe for them and they can also be part of creating a safe space, often it is kind of the adolescent or the child that feels a lot more ready to go ahead, and parents feel a little bit more overwhelmed. So I think kind of often spending time kind of unpacking what that means for parents. Actually, what is a safe space? Kind of what is exploration? What is development? How do we balance this? I think is kind of also a large part of the work. And I think that kind of balance, I suppose, between the practical and the emotional components of it. I think something else that kind of parents often find incredibly stressful around transitioning or around gender diverse children is making decisions. I think often there's kind of huge anxieties for parents. I think often many parents' biggest anxiety is just wanting the best for their child and to know what happens if their child transitions and regrets this. And I think that's often one of the biggest concerns that I think that many parents sit with. And I think there's this huge sense of I'm really responsible. What if I allow my child to go ahead with this and they make a mistake, or they kind of hold this against me at some point, and I'm going to be responsible for this decision. And I suppose kind of also get into the understanding that their child obviously needs to guide this, that only their identity can come from their child, but at the same time the parental function of putting in boundaries and setting out pacing and timing. So that can be quite challenging, but I think that's also kind of, I think, where the group helps, actually having other parents to bounce ideas off, seeing how different things work for different families, for different individuals, but then also trying to figure out how to kind of how to create a safe space, but also how to pace things out. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's really helped kind of, I think, parents being able to do that together or figure that out together in the group.
So in terms of the social needs of the families and caregivers and the youth that join our support group, I mean, there is as broad and as deep as you can imagine, and involve what Jonathan has just finished speaking about, those anxieties around when do we come out, or other ways of seeing this is how do we welcome in a sort of inner circle of protectors who then protect us against the next round of people we invite in, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that be prepared to be very pleasantly surprised. I think is the message that we mostly give the families who join us in our group, in that things have changed, but also I think we're a bit more emboldened because we've learned in the group and we know we have the support. And I think that's what's important is it used to be when we first started, I think Jonathan and I did pretty much at least 50% of the speaking, to be fair, Jonathan, because we'd be answering like direct questions. But very quickly, I think, we've gotten to a point where we really speak very little, and other parents chime in with advice quite quickly. So it's really nice to be able to offer diverse experiences to families so that they can see what resonates best with them. We talk a lot about the practicalities of social transitioning. For example, at one point, there was a group of young trans girls, parents of young trans girls who all had girls who wanted to start ballet. So they went off on a mission to figure out how to do tucking and what best underwear to use, things like that. We've shared binders between families with trans boys. And we also have a referral list, which really has a whole list of medical practitioners in our area, from psychologists all the way through to speech therapists, surgeons, and so on, who we've tested out, and we're referring them to each other. And in that list, we also include things like where you can buy binders or tucking underwear and so on. There's a lot of work we do around schools. We also keep a list of affirming schools in the Johannesburg, Pretoria area that we can refer each other to. And we talk a lot about how to manage speaking to schools. And on the side, a bunch of us have also been very involved in working with the Department of Basic Education around putting guidelines for the inclusion of all SOGIESC children in schools. And so fingers crossed that particular goalpost has been moved annually for 5 years now, but we are assured this is the year. So we will be very happy to share that with you as soon as it comes out. We have also spoken a lot about the difference in our children, that we've got very outgoing children who want to be out and proud and openly trans at school or openly non-binary. And then we've got kids who really would rather operate in stealth mode and be known by their gender identity and name and not what is on their birth certificate. And that is quite a tricky area because of the difficulties we've been having with the Department of Home Affairs around name and gender marker changes. And I don't think we need to speak much more about that. But we've been having quite a lot of success through school interventions. And I think that's probably a discussion for another evening. But Jonathan has particularly been leading on some really important school interventions to help schools include our children. We, as Jonathan mentioned, don't just speak about like in-your-face transgender or non-binary issues, but we go straight into general parenting as well, and trying to figure out what is a trans issue and what is just a general parenting issue. There's generally every year quite a lot of discussion about who has passed maths and who hasn't, and things like that, which are normal parenting issues. And around something like dating and breakups, we all realized that this was something that was a huge anxiety issue for all of us. So we got in Dr. Eli Rosen to come and speak to us. And they basically gave us a sex education session, which I personally gained an awful lot from. And I think it was it was really very humbling to be reminded that, in fact, not any one of us knows everything, and why would we think that our kids aren't capable of learning all of this if we make the resources available? So that has been quite something. Around co-parenting, there's been some very interesting dynamics in our group. We've had some great positive dynamics where, for example, an ex-husband and wife arrive with the wife's new husband, and all three are there for their child, and they've all come together to the group. Two divorced parents time sharing the group, with mom coming for the first couple of years, and then dad and new mom coming to learn a bit more before their new trans daughter was arriving to visit. So really heartwarming stuff. But then, of course, we do have a lot of issues with divorced parents where, for example, a mom is very supportive, but dad just refuses. And I think it's a lot of heartbreak, which we obviously, when it gets to very, very serious things, and I'm speaking to parents offline, I absolutely send them off for therapy. This is not something our group can manage. There's been a lot of discussion in our group around balancing the focus on siblings, and that, why is it that the one sibling is getting all the attention and all the family resources and not the other? Or in other cases, as in Madeleine's case, where you have families with multiple gender diverse siblings. So there's been quite a lot of discussion around how to deal with that, and I think it is something we still have to get on top of. But I suddenly looked at the clock, Jonathan. Sorry, let me hand over to you.
I think you can see both Melinda and I are quite passionate. Melinda, this is also your slide.
Oh, well, I think that's just a really nice fuzzy picture of one of the picnics that Jonathan mentioned that we had in Zoo Lake. Parents not invited, that's just the young people, but it is quite fabulous when we see them all together.
I think it's also been quite nice to have informal get-togethers. So I think this is also one of the advantages of having a healthcare professional and non-healthcare professional. So I generally, when there's casual social interaction, I step out just because I think there's already kind of a lot of frame and boundary issues, maybe already having clients in the group. So I think I often then would step out of informal spaces, but it's been really great. I think I know that the parents, the caregivers, and the youth have really appreciated informal spaces where it is meeting for a picnic at a park, and I think that just has different dynamics. And obviously, it's there's something about socializing in a different way. And I think that's also obviously when Melinda, Kellen, and Akani can step in, and yeah. So I think we do share the space in different ways. Okay, so then thinking about healthcare needs, obviously something quite interesting to this group. Obviously, there's many different forms of medical or healthcare intervention for gender diverse youth. So I think obviously many things that many different individuals or families can go through. I think it's obviously something that's quite overwhelming for parents. I think, as I mentioned just now, that sense of responsibility. But I think even when there's a sense of maybe being ready to do more research or ready to go ahead with certain things, it's a bit overwhelming finding resources. So I think Melinda mentioned the resource list just now. I know that's been quite a big thing for us to collate. And I think also just parents being put at ease by hearing, okay, my child did see this doctor, or my child saw this speech therapist, and I can trust them, or they've already made a big difference. I think sometimes this can be quite a scary world, actually, just who can I trust, who can I rely on. So I think actually finding healthcare providers, I think, is a big worry for many parents. I think just wanting to know that they're going to be in good hands. So I think sometimes there's specific I suppose gender affirming healthcare interventions, but I think other times it's also just wanting general healthcare. So I don't know, is it just finding a GP that's going to be comfortable with my child? They're maybe not going to be administering HRT, but actually just they're not going to be transphobic, or they're not going to make a kind of be prejudiced around the child's gender identity. So there's those type of needs. So I think also just sometimes finding people, even if it's not people offering gender affirming healthcare, but just kind of those type of referrals and recommendations are really helpful. But then other times there's also intersections between I suppose gender affirming healthcare and the kind of general healthcare that I think has also been tricky. And I think this is what a lot of parents find quite overwhelming is sometimes it's hard to know who manages things. I know often we've also leaned towards kind of discussions around who's the case manager or who's the primary doctor. So for example, I know some of the things that families have struggled with is kind of interactions between Uracutan and testosterone. And actually, is this the dermatologist domain? Is it the endocrinologist, or is it the doctor prescribing the hormones? And I think then getting caught up in, and I think sometimes it's actually quite hard because I think parents land up playing that role. So one of the doctors often is a kind of someone providing hormones. There's a psychiatrist, maybe other professionals like a dermatologist. They might not kind of know what else is going on, or might not keep track as in detail of what's going on. And I think that's difficult because then I think parents are the first to realize this, but obviously they're generally not medical professionals. And I think that can be a little bit stressful. So I think kind of trying to find a core person, and I think also finding someone that's quite readily available. And often a lot of healthcare professionals providing gender affirming healthcare can be very busy, and I know that's also been a big stress for families is actually making sure there's a healthcare professional they can email and get a response in a relatively kind of manageable time period. I know sometimes that's been a little bit overwhelming. Something happens, but kind of can they get hold of the healthcare professional? So I think having a kind of primary healthcare professional or primary doctor, I think has also been quite helpful. I think also kind of things like preventative healthcare. I know this is where I think Dr. Eli Rosen helps us quite a bit, thinking about actually, even if your child identified this way, these are still this child's medical needs, and how do we kind of make sure we keep track of that and aware of these needs. And then I think kind of funding has also been a big thing. I think we obviously know kind of access to gender affirming healthcare is a big challenge in South Africa. So kind of often the struggle around, can we find something in the public sector? I think there's very little available for minors in South Africa. So often it is more on the private sector, at least in the focus of our group. But then I think even with not just finding healthcare professionals and access to healthcare, but actually then funding that. So I know that's often been a big stress for parents. So I think kind of talking about medical aids, I think that's something that's been quite useful. I think Melinda actually did a lot of kind of organizing around this. Actually, I think we've had specific meetings around how to lobby with specific medical aids. I think the medical aids sometimes offer things that seem quite hopeful and then actually kind of are quite disappointing. They can be quite, it's quite hard as a parent to take on a whole corporation. It's something quite different as a group of parents to take on a corporation. And I think that's also been quite useful, is actually kind of parents getting together and advocating together and figuring out how are we going to tackle this? How do we change the system? How do we push on certain things? I think also around funding, we recently also talked about crowdfunding. I know that was a recent discussion that we hadn't had before, but I think that's also come up in the group. And then obviously kind of the other aspect of kind of healthcare is also kind of mental health care needs, obviously knowing that kind of gender diverse youth are at particular risk of developing certain healthcare difficulties due to social stigma or kind of the challenges with dysphoria. But then also other things that overlap. I think kind of is also something we've kind of finding our feet with is also neurodiversity, or this very high co-occurrence between gender diversity and neurodiversity. So that's also become a larger part of the group, is kind of navigating things like ADHD and autism. And then I think also just the timing of the group, there was a lot of things around figuring out the pandemic together, providing stress kind of support during the pandemic, but also kind of nuanced things. Actually, kind of often many trans youth can be quite withdrawn just because they struggle with kind of feeling safe socially, and then kind of what to do that with the pandemic, and kind of also kind of limiting screen time, and actually that's kind of primarily the way of safe socializing. So I think kind of trying to balance those things out. There was also a lot of figuring out together throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, and before I get onto legal needs, I think also part of the healthcare side of things is exactly what Jonathan was saying, is that as parents, one becomes aware that we are often the experts in our children's case, or we're put in the position of being the experts. Let's put it that way, because we certainly aren't. And I think that's been quite overwhelming for a lot of parents to realize that they do have to advocate very strongly for their children and really drive their children's healthcare needs very hard. And we've had some really positive interactions, for example, with a new medical practice, or for example, my child psychiatrist, where I just kind of took a red pen to the intake forms and And people are really happy to take that advice, you know, and also around speaking to receptionists, for example, in those doctors' offices, around how they talk to trans patients, how they are careful to make sure that even if this is the name on the medical aid, perhaps, you know, that is not the name that that person needs to be called. And these are all really important things, especially for awkward teenagers, most of whom are going through their second puberty. You know, like being called by the wrong name just once can make them crumple for a week. So it's something we take quite seriously. Anyhow, that's part of the legal needs. And I think really, just to sum this up, you know, so much is driven by our identity number, our name, and our gender marker, that, you know, if one is trying to be stealth at school and you're 15 or 14, or if you are going into a doctor's office and your parents' medical aid card has you down with a certain name or gender marker, it really is exceptionally difficult to operate. So as parents, we've had to always step in first. And, you know, I know, for example, that when my son first came out, I sent an email to everybody who deals with him and laid down the law that this is how you will treat my child. And, you know, it's easy for me because I have that kind of extrovert nature, but it's a lot more difficult for some parents who don't feel that they can, who feel that they have a respectful relationship with their doctors and can't tell them that this isn't okay. So we've dealt with quite a lot of issues around that. But I think most importantly, just from a medical perspective, from your perspective, it's just a reminder. And I mean, I'm aware of the audience that we're speaking to, so perhaps that's enough on that. Hey, Jonathan. Yeah.
Thank you, Melinda. I think also just knowing that there's a lot of change that has happened with Home Affairs, but I think particularly a lot of support on the ground. I think there's one thing, I think Be True to Me and Gender Dynamics has documents around how to approach Home Affairs, but I think particularly parents are incredibly anxious around how to do this, which Home Affairs to go to, who's got good experiences. And then I think also that follow-up. So no, that's made a very big difference. I think parents actually going through the process and getting numbers of higher up Home Affairs officials. So actually kind of, we've submitted this, nothing's happening 6 months down the line, who do I contact? And I know that's been incredibly empowering, but I think also just kind of, it's weird how we have a Home Affairs kind of catch up, I think each support group meeting, but it's actually really nice to see things starting to go through, because I think often there's this anxiety, but then, okay, so-and-so went through, actually maybe mine will go through soon, or they contacted the right person. So I know that there's actually been a lot of support around actually navigating the Home Affairs process. Okay, so I think coming to the end of the presentation, I think just kind of sharing some of the things that we've kind of learned from the group. And I think you can see we've already been sharing many of these as we go along. I think one of our earliest lessons was actually kind of the importance of keeping the youth and the parents and caregivers separate. So it was incredibly awkward for the first meeting. We had everybody together. Often, I think particularly early on in journeys, kind of parents and youth are in very, very different spaces. And I think that kind of clashes. And I think even we also kind of tried to get some feedback from the youth group at one point, and I think that also just impinged on their space. And it was, yeah, I think it's really important to have those two groups separate. So it's really inconvenient to have them at the same time, be it online or in person, but actually kind of keeping the youth and parents, that kind of really seems to create a kind of a safe space for everybody. And I think also encouraging parents to say, this is your space. We obviously would like you to be as firming as possible to your child in person with your child, but this is your space to fumble or kind of struggle, and I think that also creates kind of something that's quite useful, kind of obviously looking after the child, but obviously looking after the parents and making sure the parents' needs aren't kind of impinging too much on the child's needs. I think we've also really realized there's quite different needs according to the age of children. So predominantly most of the parents that attend the group regularly kind of have children largely between the age of 10 and 20. But we realize kind of often the needs of prepubescent children and post-pubescent children are quite different. So we do sometimes have parents of prepubescent children that join the group. We do sometimes give a little bit of a disclaimer saying, sometimes you are going to hear things about surgery and hormones, and that can be a bit overwhelming, especially when these are many years off, or something that you maybe not wanting to think about yet, or actually might be quite scary. So we kind of, we do try to balance it. I think it's also recently kind of started a little separate group for some of the younger children kind of on WhatsApp. But I think trying to think about actually, ideally, we probably should have two different groups, just because the needs are quite different according to the age of children. I think it's also been really helpful to have a facilitated space. I think obviously maintaining things around confidentiality, non-judgment, fair participation, and then also managing group dynamics. I know that's probably been one of the more challenging parts with facilitation, is just making sure there's not too much conformity and peer pressure. So we often really start the group saying that there's no one way of being a parent, there's no one way of being trans, there's no one way of being non-binary. Because I think sometimes there is a little bit of a pressure. I need to fit in, or I need to do the right thing. And obviously, parents are incredibly vulnerable just in themselves, but I think then parenting a gender diverse child, there's a worry that, I'm going to be seen as doing the wrong thing, but really encouraging there's many different ways of doing this. And yes, we'll get ideas from each other and make suggestions, but there's no one right way to do this. I think that's been quite important in the facilitation. And then also just really holding diverse opinions and experiences, I think also quite key. I think sometimes parents, they are parents, I think, as Melinda said, they are a bit more extroverted or can speak out, but making sure we having everybody's voices and everybody's feeling heard or finding their way. And then I think it's also quite useful to think about how do we connect with other organizations or support systems, and also providing different options. Our group's not going to be the perfect group for everybody, but knowing there are other groups or other ways of reaching out or getting help, I think that's also been really useful. And then I think also bringing in people from different organizations or different spaces. I know that's been really nice to have guests in the group as well.
I think before we go on to challenges, maybe just a few more lessons that have been quite interesting. Sorry, Jonathan, is that, we've connected up, for example, with the Cape Town support group for parents with gender diverse children. And the way they organize is over WhatsApp. So we all connect with each other. I think it's quite overwhelming. A WhatsApp space is not for me, but it's really helpful for somebody who's going through something immediate and really needs to reach out immediately, and there will be a community there to hold them and to hold space. I mean, Madeleine has an amazing WhatsApp group that does more than just provide support, but provides information as well. So there's a lot of support spaces specifically for families with gender diverse kids that we can refer people to. But like, as Jonathan says, we don't pretend that we can be everything to everyone. So, we make this information freely available so that people don't feel awkward if they don't find our space suits them. They can just move on. But similarly, and I mean, I say this jokingly, not so jokingly, that in terms of working with NGOs in the space, we are Switzerland. We work with all NGOs that support LGBTQ people, and because we know that they are servicing an severely underserviced community. And so we really find ways to always work with NGOs in the space, and despite whatever is going on between them, we are Switzerland. So that's really important to us. Sorry, Jonathan, let's get to our last slide.
I'm glad you're really covering some of the challenges. So I think navigating NGO politics is something that I think Melinda and I don't have a huge amount of experience with, but I know that's also been part of working with the group. I think also one of the challenges of the group is around representation. I think we also, when you originally started the group, really trying to make sure the group was accessible, it's available in public transport. We originally started in Braamfontein, and then soon moved to Parktown, Killarney, and so really wanting the group to be diverse and for many different people to attend the group. But I think also what we've really landed up in the group is still not quite representative of South Africa. The group is still largely of a higher socioeconomic status and largely white. So I think that also adds a challenge. I know just often groups make a very big difference when you join a group and there's people that mirror you, and I think that's something that we've been quite aware of when parents that are maybe different from the typical group member actually join. Do they feel isolated? Are there people they feel like they can connect to? So I know that's something we're also trying to figure out. What does this mean, and how do we navigate that? And then also, since COVID, we've actually had a lot fewer fathers participating in the group. It's actually interesting. I think our original group was much bigger and more dads, but I think it's also been, I don't know if it's online or clashes with watching the rugby or other gender stereotyped activities, but I think it's a bit harder for guys to connect online. And I suppose also, there's also be trying to deconstruct gender, but also knowing that I think there are different ways that maybe fathers and moms can navigate these spaces. So I think that's also something we've been quite aware of, but I know it's also been helpful. I think there's a recently formed WhatsApp group for dads in Cape Town, so I think also having those spaces to refer to.
Both Jonathan and I were like, what? oh my gosh, what do you mean a group just for fathers? It was very confusing for us, but we shared the information and zipped our lips. Hey, Jonathan.
It's very interesting to navigate these things in a gender space, obviously trying to think about gender in more complex ways, but I think also sometimes also trying to think about what individuals' needs are and how they or also rely on more typical ways of navigating gender, I suppose.
Yeah.
And then I think kind of just sometimes kind of the challenge is a lot of the parents that do join the group are already in relatively good spaces, are already quite affirming. I think they often do need help and really benefit from the support, but generally the parents that do join, I think they've done a lot of work or maybe aren't as threatened by their children's identities or the changes that are going to come. So I think kind of sometimes we do also think about how do we reach parents that are struggling in other ways or in more ways. I think that's difficult, and I know not everybody kind of feels comfortable in a group space. So I think that's something I think we also maybe also part of the discussion tonight should be thinking about is how do we also help parents, in different ways. Trying to think there's something else I wanted to add on to that. I think, yeah, so the other thing that we have also helped navigate with that is Melinda's been really good at matchmaking parents. So if parents actually are keen to get help, but also find the group a bit overwhelming, Melinda actually then kind of would confidentially matchmake parents, kind of so parents in a similar situation or similar age child, or sometimes you kind of need an Afrikaans dad to speak to an Afrikaans dad, that type of thing. So I think that's also been really helpful, having this other thing that's maybe not core part of the group, but actually kind of ways of kind of encouraging parents to get together in less threatening ways, or ways that feel more manageable, if it's going for a walk or having a phone conversation or going for coffee. And we know that's also made quite a big difference. And I think also something as we've needed kind of multiple spaces for different ages children. I think we also kind of trying to figure that out now with the youth, because a lot of our youth have actually aged quite a bit over the 3.5 years we've been running the group. So I think a lot of youth that actually were originally in high school when we started the group have now left school. And I think also knowing that they have specific needs, that's also been a challenge, is kind of how do we continue this? Because I think having a 14-year-old and a 20-year-old sitting in the same support space can also be a bit challenging. And so we've also been thinking about there's probably the need for having a late school or after school age group kind of youth space. I think kind of youth obviously kind of being a broader definition, but I think kind of also, I think as we go over time, I think thinking about more nuanced spaces, I think kind of also would be more comfortable for many people, both parents and youth.
Yeah.
Okay, I think those are the key points. I am also very aware of time, so it's also going to be nice to get to the discussion and the panel discussion. Melinda, I think just to share this last bit.
Yeah, one of the most important things to me as a parent is trying to encourage other parents to become really active advocates and allies for gender diverse, transgender, non-binary youth. And I have to say that it's been quite disappointing, but if I get my grips on anybody, it's always exciting to unleash the volunteer in our parents. So that is a big challenge that we continue to work on. But the upside of it, sorry, going back to the little advert, the upside of all of it is this big event, for example, that we are doing jointly with Iranti. Matimba and Iranti is putting on Friday night for Trans Day of Visibility. And I think what's really exciting about this is that Cole Collison, a journalist, a filmmaker, I think working for the human rights NGO now, and made a very short film. It's about 20 minutes long, and he entitled it The Unexceptional Parent. And it's basically these little clips of sound bites and little videos from different families all over South Africa talking about how they love their children, how they raise their gender diverse kids, and basically that we all consider ourselves quite unexceptional because our job is to love our children and to raise them. And so, yeah, there we go. That's happening on Friday night. So if you're around Joburg, please come. And thank you so much for letting us share this with you. It actually does mean an awful lot. And thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. That is such a rich amount of data. That's the word we like using in the clinical world, amount of data that you've actually gathered through all this group experiences. If we had a bunch of parents here tonight, we wouldn't be able to glean all of that information in one session because it is something that you build up over time. So that's been very useful. I'm in half dark here, I apologize. I would like to quickly ask Carol. So there's three of us that's sort of officially on the panel tonight, although it's actually just a round robin discussion. And Carol Musikanth is got some conflicting other things that's very important that's also going on that she needs to be attending to. And we're very happy that she could also join us as both a parent and a clinician. And so I'd like to hand over to her and just give a little bit of an introduction and maybe some little snapshot of experiences that she thinks is important for clinicians to hear about from a parent's point of view. Carol, I'm going to hand over to you.
Hi. Thank you, Madeleine. Hi, everybody. I listened to what the others had to say, and of course, I understand and I can confirm what they're saying, but I think for me, working with parents, I did my master's on the trauma that parents experience when their child transitions. So I look at it from a completely different perspective, although what Jonathan spoke about is relevant in my practice too, but my focus is more on the parents. So I work with the parents and their issues that they're experiencing. And I think for myself, when my child transitioned, the important factors for me was firstly education. The fact that I knew nothing about it, I feared it. And we always fear something we know nothing about. The second thing was that I found out that it wasn't only my child that transitioned, but my whole family was transitioning. The whole dynamics in my family were shifting from having one son to now having two sons, and my oldest child in the Jewish religion, especially where the oldest son has a very specific role to play if you're in a traditional Jewish family. And my middle son took that role. Now suddenly my oldest child, who was a girl, has transitioned to being a boy. And now what happens to that role? Suddenly my oldest child said, no, but I'm the oldest son now. I need to take on that role. And my middle son was sitting there thinking, now where do I fit? So, having to navigate these things, and then friends and family members, everyone has to transition. Everyone has to get on board. So it's not only the child, it's the whole family. I also found for me and with the parents that I work with, there's a lot of fear, and often we as clinicians, we interpret it as them being not supportive or being transphobic, when in actual fact, what really is happening is they fear for the future of their children. I remember when my child came out to me, I thought I was a very liberal parent. I thought that I was very accepting. But when my child came out to us at the clinic, because he had tried to take his life, came out to us at the clinic and said, the reason is that I just don't fit in. I cannot think like a woman. I don't have the thought process. I'm a man in a woman's body. And it was like someone had hit me in my solar plexus. I was totally taken aback. And I thought to myself, I didn't show, obviously, to my child because I care about my child. And I said, what I said to my child was, well, there you go. Now it's in the open. Now we know. Why didn't you come out with this before and tell us? Now we have a solution. We can move forward. And you can be a boy. Nobody is holding you back. But when I walked out there, I fell over and I cried. And I said to my husband, I can't do this. This is not for me. I don't mind it being out there, but I don't want it here. How am I going to cope with this? How am I going to have my child transition? What are people going to say? I was so concerned about what other people are going to say. It affected me so badly. And I realized that it wasn't that I didn't want this for my child. I was going to support my child. I was just concerned about what the future held for my child. And I think that is what we need to understand, is the parents come with us with so much fear of what their child is going to go through. The invasion of the surgery. I don't want this to happen to my child. I don't want them to sit with scars. I don't want them to go, what about grandchildren? What about if they change their mind and they want to have children? So it's more around the fear of the process rather than being transphobic. The other thing that I found in myself and also with the other parents is the sense of loss. Because although you're gaining a daughter, or a son, you're losing your daughter. The name was so special. My mom had passed away. My mom-in-law had passed away. We'd used both their names and given our firstborn their names in memory of our parents. And here, suddenly they want a new name that is so foreign to me as a parent. How do I work this through? How do I just accept that this is now no longer Mary or Jane? This is now John. It doesn't come off your tongue. And it's not that you don't want to. You're just finding it so difficult. And this is where I work with parents to come to terms with these aspects. children, my child made me hide all the pictures away. I'd done them a beautiful painting for her bat mitzvah that was a place of pride on my wall. I had to take that painting down, and it's sitting in the back of my garage. And sometimes when I go to my garage, I look at that painting because I have memories of that child then. And it's not something that you can just brush away. And it's not that I'm not accepting. I have the most beautiful son. And if I must tell you how I fought for this child with Home Affairs when they wouldn't change his ID documents, I walked in there with the Sex Adjustment Act. I went to the desk, I showed them the act, and I said to them, this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is what you're supposed to be upholding. You're not doing this for my son. Where are his documents? Why haven't we got them? And when they said, no, we've sent them off, we haven't heard from them, and I looked over the counter and I saw my son's documents, I lifted my skirt, I climbed onto the desk, right over to the other side, and I grabbed that documentation and I shoved it in their face. And I said to them, you haven't done my child's documentation. So I'm the greatest advocate for my child, for any other transgender child, because I don't only go to Home Affairs for my child, I go for other children too. But that doesn't mean that I'm not suffering inside. That doesn't mean that I'm not feeling the sense of loss, that my child, is my child going to find someone to love? Is my child going to be happy? Will there be someone that will look past this? If it comes out at work and they find out that my child is transgender, will he lose his job? Will he be able to move forward? So all of these concerns, we have to hold our parents and we have to help them get through and work through these and find ways of, so how can I help my child? How can I be more supportive of my child? I also have parents who have huge resentment, not against their children, but because of the financial cost. So I have to give up my holiday. My other children are complaining because they can't go and do X, Y, Z, because now I have to take that money because I have to do surgeries for my child, because the medical aid is not going to pay for them. And it's not that I don't want to, I am doing it. But how do I balance having to my other children to understand what has been taken from them in order to support my trans child? So we have to look at these factors that parents are also experiencing around these different aspects that we often don't even think about. I think of my parents who come from African communities, a multicultural group, come from a lower socioeconomic group. They can't afford to even come to the meetings, because I used to have parents' meetings the first Tuesday of every month. They couldn't come to my parent meetings because they never had the transport. So my husband and I started a fund and we paid for their transport, and I gave them a meal every Tuesday. So I give my parents a meal. We then talk about helping them find places that they can go, like Grooteskeer, the transgender clinic, putting them in touch with the clinic there so that they can access hormones, writing referrals for the clinics, the local clinics, so that they can access hormones there, and helping them navigate these obstacles that we as a more privileged people don't even know and understand. So I think when we look at our clients, we have to look at them in context of what they're actually going through and what they're experiencing. And I think that's probably my contribution.
Well, thank you very much, Carol. That's why it's lovely to hear from people who's actually been there, because you can really feel the heart behind all those things. And I definitely also felt very, well, yeah, I understand those moments that we go through as parents. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one or two small things from my side, and then we're going to open for a short discussion, and I'll tell you a little bit how we're going to do that, just in terms from a time point of view. But I think we can suddenly feel there's this wealth of information actually that we need to keep into consideration. This is not something that one can completely delve into in a short 1 hour session. And I think the aspects I want to bring is the challenge for me in terms of finding a team to look after the medical aspects of my child. So I live in East London, and so you're quite a little bit fortunate if you're in Cape Town and Johannesburg and KZN a little bit. There is teams out there, but there are no teams in East London. And I mean, I was a medical professional, so that sort of helped. I know the doctors, I know the systems, I know who's around. And I had this sort of isolation of, well, how do I put a team together who's going to look after my children? What's also been interesting for me is my youngest has got type 1 diabetes and was diagnosed at the age of 12. So we were already in the endocrinology system. And it's been quite interesting to contrast my needs as a parent with a child who is diabetic versus a child who is trans. So at that stage, when we're still very much engaging with the endocrinologist, my child had not yet come out, still a bit young, but he's now come out as transgender. And but at that stage, my eldest was non-binary. And so we were meeting with the endocrinologist for my diabetic child. And so I was trying to open the conversation, trying to find out, are you seeing trans people? And trying to get it's difficult. It's not just about, are you prescribing for trans people? It's about that thing of trust, Jonathan, that you were saying, but how are you going to treat me and my family as trans people? So I was approaching it a little bit from a medical HIV clinician society. We're going to do some trainings where you at kind of level, trying to downplay the parent. First, before I told them that I had a non-binary kid, and you could see they were sort of, well, I've got some clients because I have to kind of attitude, because they're the only person, and she's the only woman doing endocrinology in East London in private. And then at the end I said to her, oh, and my eldest child is non-binary, and my second child was sitting right there, and she went, oh, shame. And that's when I realized you can't be my doctor. But she's the only endocrinology person who's doing transgender and private care in East London. So where do I go? And that was this real challenge in terms of trying to find a team. And then I've realized you obviously don't just need a doctor. I needed a psychologist potentially. I need hopefully occupational or speech therapy possibly. And here I was as a clinician, because I understand, trying to put my team together. But if you're a transgender parent at the moment in East London, how do you identify that team? And how do you find that group of people? And we don't have an answer for that yet. And I think that's one of the big challenges for parents, is that you become the person who has to put the team together. You have to figure out who all these people are. And that's where the groups have been so useful. So it's not my WhatsApp group, by the way, Melinda. There's a lovely WhatsApp group that Chris has put together called Fabulous Parents. And it's I think largely Cape Town based group, but that's been an amazing group to ask questions about which psychiatrist do you go to, so there are, for example, some clinicians who's very good with the children but terrible with the parents, and how we start trying to find out who's going to be my people, who can I feel safe to take my children with. And I think for a healthcare facility to be very clear about where people are safe and affirmed is very important when parents starting to find their way. So that list of resources, Path SA putting together resources, I think us as Path SA can really help making visible those teams. If you need to start putting a team together, you can have an online, so we've been using Chris is an online psychologist. You can use Megan. I've been using Megan a lot. Everybody wants a trans doctor. I send her details. So trying to find out who are people that we can actually use and recommend clinicians for, because you need a team. And I need a lot more support actually as a parent around the issues of transgender than I do around diabetes. So the diabetes which has been a terrible life-threatening disease and has had its own things, but has actually been much more less complicated than us negotiating our lives as you say, as a queer family, and negotiating our families, negotiating our communities, negotiating the schools, negotiating all these different boundaries. And yeah, we need health, we need teams around us, and how can we find those people? So what I'd like to do, because it's 8:05, I assume this is normally a 1-hour session. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. And what I thought we could perhaps do from those that's been listening is identify specific either CP tasks for the future as clinicians. So either things we want more training on, or things we want to do more research on, or things we want to create, be it tools or databases, but some ideas of things we want to take into the future. We don't have a lot of time to do massive discussion, but it will be nice to come out with some active sort of things that Path SA or we as clinicians can take on into the future to support families in this regard. So I'd like to open the floor.
Madeleine, we do sometimes go until 8:30.
Okay,
So
so we've
there
got
is a few minutes for
those that
discussion.
people need to go, then they can go. But then yes, so then we can open. We can play it by ear. Morgan also offered to chair if needed, but I
Yeah,
think
no,
we-
motion had to run because it's early morning in New
That's fine.
Zealand, so he had
So I'm
to.
happy then to just chair that, and then yeah, people can. I'm quite happy. We're quite a small group for people to either just unmute or you can put your hand up, whatever's easiest. Okay, Carol needs to go. Bye, Carol. Thank you very much. She's been dealing with other important life things. Here.
Maybe I could
Yeah.
jump in with my new fancy glasses.
I like it.
One thing I don't think you spoke about a lot, Jonathan, Melinda. Thanks first of all for your presentations. All it's been really useful for me actually to sort of grapple with all these questions. And in fact, this week I'm on a panel for sexuality and gender division, and we're talking about coming out. It's a theme. There are about 5 presentations, and one of the, I think often when we talk about coming out in the queer world, we tend to think about gay and lesbian folk, and we don't think about trans people, non-binary people, intersex people, and those comings out are layered in so many other different ways. But you didn't talk a lot about perhaps children who are neurodiverse on the spectrum. Is there anything you want? Because I'm thinking, like bringing young people together to socialize. For some people, that may be very difficult and awkward and uncomfortable. So how are you managing that dimension? Not a difficult question at all.
I think, Pierre, I think the answer for me is there's definitely a need for support spaces that speak to neurodiversity. I'd like to anyone to hopefully correct me if I'm wrong, but I know at least in Johannesburg, we haven't actually been able to find any support spaces for neurodiverse children. I know there's an OT that runs a social group, and I think similarly in Cape Town, I think there's, I think Cole that presented last week, actually, last month, has been doing great work with kind of, I suppose, kind of social skill spaces, kind of Dungeons and Dragons groups. But I think that's definitely a need that actually kind of neurodiverse groups where there is kind of navigating social skills, navigating neurodiversity, kind of similarity in that way, but obviously kind of often there's, there's a need to navigate kind of queerness in different senses in that sense as well. So I think there's definitely a need for that. I know what Akani and Kellen have been struggling with this with the youth is it has been a lot more difficult online. The parents, I think the group did shrink when we moved online with COVID, but I think the parents cope a lot better online, where I think there is something about adolescents and then possibly a lot of adolescents that also are neurodiverse kind of having to kind of pauses are just that much more heavy online, or it's a lot trickier, where I think sometimes what they would do is just have art supplies and you can go kind of sit in the corner and you're still around other people, or you can find your person and you can interact more directly one-on-one, where I think there's something about having a group together. So I know that's why the picnics and actually the more recent in-person get-togethers have actually been preferable for the youth, because I think it is just easier to navigate those spaces. I think there's something a little bit more organic, and I think in that the neurodiversity also speaks to that. I think there's something about kind of also needing to be mindful of actually there's different ways of articulating things or connecting or socializing, and I think we also need to be quite innovative in how we think about that. So it would actually be great, maybe a possible meeting would be getting kind of a focus on actually the youth support space and how to think about these things, because I think that would make quite a big difference. But it's definitely something that's there's a need for.
I can also just comment.
Sorry, Madeleine.
Go, Melinda.
I was just going to say that, when we first started, we heard a lot about neurodiversity from the Cape Town families. And I remember like Jonathan and I going like, what are they talking about? Like, I mean, we haven't heard about any of this, then you have a support group running for a few months and then we all start like sharing our med stories, oh, well, my kid's on ADHD. Well, oh, well, my kid's on the spectrum and my kids, and then you suddenly start to realize that this co-occurrence, as it's spoken of, as best as I can understand it, is a very real thing. And yeah, it starts to make a few things. I mean, I think, okay, excuse my language, I think I may have once said to Jonathan, is this like something that, is my child doing this because they might be on the spectrum, or are they just being a little arsehole? And I think that's the difficulty and probably the tightrope that we all kind of walk on with a lot of what we're dealing with the youth in our group. But yeah, that was quite an interesting realization when we started to learn more. And so recently, like, we send out an email once a month to the families in our group, and I will pop in an advert if I find one. So for example, I know of a music therapist who runs a choir for neurodiverse teens. And it also says at the bottom of the advert, neurotypicals are also welcome. So, you know, things like that we will share with families in our group, but that we're not involved in. But I think we need to learn an awful lot more. I do.
And I think also like specific intersections. I know like now when we think about school referrals, it's not often just is the school gender affirming, but is it actually, does it fit for this person's neurodiversity? Actually, does it meet their needs in other ways? So I know we've also had to kind of think more complexly around this constant interaction. I know that that's also been one of the other areas where, yeah, it does require constant thought.
Yeah, it's just interesting to add on, in East London area, we've started a GSA, a Gender and Sexualities Alliance, just to open it, just a general group in East London, because we needed some sort of, and we've got queer events every single month. And quite a large part of that has actually been trans community, and we've got quite a lot of trans teenagers, of which probably about half are neurodivergent, I would say, which sort of fits the demographic. And I think what we've realized with the grouping as well is, firstly, neurodivergent kids do need social interaction. So one quite often thinks of them as, because they're socially awkward, that they're also socially avoidant, but that's not true. They're very desperate to build social relationships. They just struggle with that dynamics. And because we've created this very safe group, and because such a lot of the trans kids are just, you know, trans giftedness, they're all just quite extraordinary, it's actually become a really lovely space for these kids to come into. And there's been all kinds of friendships that's been forming and been hanging out outside of the GSA circles. And that happened naturally. That was not, and naturally how a queer group sort of automatically created a safe space for those neurodivergent kids. So that was just an interesting observation. And then just on a separate thing, you're mentioning this coming out. It's interesting when you talk about coming out, because when we're discussing coming out, we very much focus on the experiences of the individual coming out, but the persons they most often come out to are parents. So that's the first, quite often the first person you have to come out, or if you don't come out to them, that's the one you have the biggest stress about, is coming out to parents, and how parents handle that and manage that. And it would be quite interesting to look at workshops with school, if what would you do if your child came out to you, and it could be, so it's just interesting in terms of, you know, how do we create preparation for the communities, for parents in general, as part of teaching parents about parenting, to also start thinking about, in your children's identity development, there's all kinds of things kids come out as, whether they've decided to study art instead of medicine or whatever it might be. And how do we deal as parents deal with our children's individuality when it doesn't necessarily fit in with our ideas or plans or what we were connected to. So that's quite interesting, yeah, that conversation.
You know, Madeleine, one of the things that I wanted to just mention, and I'm sorry Carol had to go, but you know, everything Carol raised is so, it resonates 100% in terms of what we hear from new families. And if I cast my mind back years and years, you know, just the sense of bewilderment when your child comes out to you, and all of those things that she said were valid, but I think it's really important to focus a little bit more on what you've just mentioned, Madeleine, the trans giftedness, you know. And I think often in our group, we remind ourselves, hey, what is the fabulous thing my fabulous child has done in the last month? Like, let's not just focus on the difficulties and the bullying and all those things that are very real, and by the way, happen to kids who are not trans as well. And so I think that's been really important. And one of our first members actually signed off on something that she wrote to us, more love, less fear. So that's become our little byline for our group, is to just focus, more love, less fear. And it's, I have to say that when I've hit little wobbles, I really do think about that. And it does become a little bit of a, you know, a superpower. We more love, less fear, and off we go. Yeah.